of the racial reckoning following the death of George Floyd, Regis Korpinski's Paquette, in order to have conversations around difficult and contentious issues that were happening and around which we needed to increase knowledge and awareness. So, for example, around systemic racism, around racial profiling, and around efforts to come to terms with what is to be done. We found two people who inspired these kinds of conversations historically and today. One of whom is Violet King, a Calgarian who became the first Black woman lawyer, and the other was Maya Angelou, the African-American author and poet who said that courage is the most important virtue because without courage, you cannot do anything else consistently. What inspires me is having the conversations with these leading thinkers from across campus, the country, and around the world who have been thinking deeply about these issues, who have been engaged with social justice movements, with university communities, with other intellectuals and activists, with an aim not just for understanding, but also for thinking of how the understanding can be mobilized in order to affect sustainable change.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Malinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President Research of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at University of Calgary. It is my honor to welcome you to the final Courageous Conversation event of the year. Courageous Conversation is a speaker series designed to spark an honest and challenging dialogue that we need to be having as a society, as a university, in order to work together to transform injustices and to build a more equitable, inclusive, and accessible futures for all. In that spirit, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Today, we are talking about ableism, about disability justice, and about equitable futures and pathways to more accessible futures in post-secondary education. Our speakers include Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle of the Siksika Outreach School, Dr. Laverne Jacobs of the University of Windsor, and Dr. J. Dolmage of the University of Waterloo. For this session, the transcription has been enabled, and copies of today's presentations by Dr. Laverne Jacobs and Dr. J. Dolmage are available for reference on our website. The link is now on your screen, as well as posted in the chat, which you can copy and paste into your browser of choice. First, I would like to introduce you to Elder Sitting Eagle, who is a language instructor at Siksika Outreach School, which sits on Siksika Treaty 7 territory. She has worked as a researcher for the Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park and has been employed with the Siksika culture and heritage community. She has traditional knowledge and insight on ways of being and doing that are important in our journey towards reconciliation. At this time, I would like to invite Elder Sitting Eagle to start us off today with a blessing. Thank you, Elder Sitting Eagle.
Okay, get connects much in one oxystikoy. And of course, the doctor pay boys just yakokit akitokanot the beach, mea. Moxiskinimats tweaks. Hello, everybody. My name is Colleen Sitting Eagle. My six-gun name is Sipan Atukomaki. With every name that is given in Siksika and in other native languages, it has a story behind it. And somehow and some way, our names kind of carry us through the years of our lives. So I'm only going to be here with you for a little bit. Like I mentioned to Malinda, I'm in between medical appointments, but I didn't want to miss out in spending a little bit of time with all of you. So I will start with a blessing to all of you. I will say it in my language, the Siksika language, and I usually kind of give you a summary of what I've included in my prayer, and I'll give a brief, I guess, a brief intro on behalf of Siksika Nation. Ayo absidukia noxistukia mochita boaka pinane edap iskanapi. O kikimatu kinana muksi machi pumapsix amuksi pukeks mane pukeks. O kikimatu kinana mustita pepukes eta pukestutsimani beta pisina. Amusis system sist pukeks istais sinaya. O kikimatu samuksi esklimatskiks aku kituts the beach manistunan its beta pisina. O kikimatu kinanu kusinanix nesukusinanix taksita menutsi manan. O kikimatu kita noxistikoi amsi nohta pepui pinanis akitut kanot the beach matapiwa. O kinok pepui amuksi estistomix amuksi nawat steaks. O kikimatu kinanam kita pepuke estistom sin mista pepuke stumukinan teko kitumanste isuksi pete pihpina. O kikene kinukan sta pokamansta o kipuno kepuka pinamaki dinonsta. Estohkumaki kitsin katkuano yakits pumuk musidi puadupina. Thank you. So in my prayer, I started off by including those disabled, young adult, and those not born. I've asked that Creator place his hand upon these children and adults that have to live day to day with their disability, whatever it may be. I've also asked for blessings upon all your families. The teachings that you do, let them be positive and let them reach those that need that extra help in their daily life. At the end of my prayer, I also mentioned that we all greet our families, that when we come home today, that we're greeted with the love from our families. I ended off my prayer by calling on elders that have guided my way through life. My late father, my late mother. I always call on these two to stand by me, especially when we're talking about a topic so serious, and that we all encountered whatever nation we're from. So that was a bit of a summary of my prayer. And this topic today, it kind of hits home, because if I go back like hundreds of years, we didn't see disability. We didn't see a lot of sicknesses, like I mentioned in the last conversation we had. It wasn't until our diet changed. I guess addictions came around, and just there's a funny thing about disabled people from our nation and in other Indian nations. We go by, people call them myths or legends, but our mothers and our grandmothers, when a woman is pregnant, they guide them, the things not to do and the things to do to bring the child into a world of more positiveness. Today in Siksika, of all the schools and the college that is located on our reserve, I'm happy to say that as of this summer, Olson College has provided accessibility to those students that are taking higher education as their future to give back to Siksika. All our schools in Siksika Nation are accessible to handicapped children. And within the elementary schools, we have a class. It used to be it used to be called special ed. When the elders heard this name that's given to a classroom of children, they asked if they could change the name of the classroom. And among the elders, they came up with a name. In our language, we say Sakakapsiks, treasured children. So our special ed classes in our schools in Siksika are the treasured children's classroom. And all disabled children and adults are registered with the Siksika Disability Services, who act as a liaison to the disabled people of Siksika. And when you talk about ableism and you talk about accepting these people with disabilities from mental, physical, you have to think back and think of our ancestors that provided us with the proper food and the proper knowledge to carry on, not to segregate them, not to look at them any different than yourself. And in our culture, we respect, we honor anybody that we walk with. So when I think of today's topic, it takes me, like I said, it hits close to home. I have nephews and a niece that were born with severe cleft palates. Some of them were seeing discrimination because of the facial features that they have after several surgeries that they've come through. And I always like to share this when the topic is disabilities. My one nephew, he's in his late 30s. He was born with a severe cleft palate. Several operations since he was a baby. And finally, the day came that everything was done. And the doctor asked him, Bucky, we have one last surgery, but it's up to you. You could have any kind of nose you want. We'll repair your nose. Because of all the surgeries, his nose became not like a normal looking nose. And my nephew, being the humble guy he is, he told the doctor, you've done everything. You've given me all the help that you can in all the 15 years that I've been here. I'll just keep this nose because God gave me this nose. And that says a lot of being humble with what God has given you. We often look at the disabled nation members, and some people will look at them in a different way, but I and many others have been brought up to respect them. God made them that way. And we have other disabilities. Now we have so many things that are going on the reserve with the drugs and the alcohol and children being born from the effects of these addictions. And all we can do as, older people is give them our prayers, give them our love. And like everybody that has to live each day with a disability, and we just have to, I guess, share our love with them and give them virtual hugs if we can. I am in a, like I said, I'm in the middle of 2 medical, kind of waiting to see if I'm going to get my knee transplant. I mean, knee replacement, knee replacement surgery. So that's where I'm at today. And I know now to walk on nature, to walk on the streets of cities, we take it for granted. Like today, I love to shop, I love to hike, but it's down to a minimum now that I can only do maybe a quarter of the mall at a time and have to rest. And I see people with walkers and canes and mobile wheelchairs, and I finally can see through their eyes. And when people look at them in a different kind of a way, like you would look at any other normal person, you start feeling the effects of, the disabled. Some people are very ignorant to the disabled people, and I'm glad that there is justice for them. There is laws that will help them along the way. And also, there's so many services out there for them. And I'm so glad to see this happening in and around our country, in and around our nation, Siksika Nation. And just to close off this little talk, I just want to give my heart out to all of you that work on these topics of ableism, disability justice, because without you, without open conversations on this topic, how can we help each individual that is faced each day with a disability, whatever disability that they're encountering? So I give you my blessings. I give you my love for the Christmas that's coming. I greet you guys and I say Merry Christmas and another Happy New Year. So thank you. And if there are questions that pop up concerning the Siksika Nation and other First Nations, I'll read them and I'll answer by email. So I'm just near the time that I have to head out to my next appointment. So my love to all of you and thank you.
And thank you very much, Elder Sitting Eagle. And so, we want to give you this tobacco as our thanks for your ongoing contributions, but also an engagement with us. So thank you so much, and good luck with your appointment. Thank you. Thank you. So Doc, today's panel discussion is going to take a deeper dive into ableism, disability justice, and accessible futures, as Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle stated. This event is taking place at the intersections of 2 key moments: the UN Day for People with Disabilities, and with the theme of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, Challenges and Possibilities. The focus of the day was on leadership and participation of persons with disabilities towards an inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. And a day that observed that our ongoing need persists to support the dignity, rights, and well-being of all peoples with disabilities. We also mark Human Rights Day, the theme of which is equality, reducing inequalities, advancing human rights. It draws on Article 1 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Today's courageous conversation is on ableism, disability justice, and accessible futures in post-secondary education. And each one of those words in the theme requires us to actually think about what they mean. and what they require of us, but how they actually require us to rethink how we think about disabilities. So access to post-secondary education is guaranteed through both domestic law and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Many would argue, including myself, that it's a human right. Yet there are still significant ways to go before post-secondary education, universities, colleges, CEGEPs, technical institutes are truly accessible for faculty, staff, students with visible and especially with invisible disabilities. So before we launch into discussion, let me first introduce our panelists. We are actually going to start with Dr. J. Dolmage. We're going to start with Dr. J. Dolmage, who is committed to disability rights in his scholarship, service, and teaching. His work brings together rhetoric, writing, disability justice, and critical pedagogy. He has written numerous books, including Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education, published in 2017. And in the link that was provided in the chat, there is a hyperlink to an open access version of that book. Dr. Dolmage is also the author of Disabled Upon Arrival, Eugenics, Immigration, and the Construction of Race and Disability, which was first published in 2018. He is also the author and founding editor. He's also the founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, also open access and provided for you to review in the link provided. I will now turn the floor over to Dr. J. Dolmage, who will be speaking to us on the topic of how we make universities on ableism, disability justice, and accessible futures in post-secondary education, and how we actually confront the challenge of academic ableism, accessibility, and going beyond accommodation. Dr. Dolmage.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm going to get right into it here, and I'm going to be talking about academic ableism. I'm going to make the case that the university actually sorts the population by a medicalized and legalistic definition of ability, and it does so really effectively. Universities function to keep certain groups of individuals out of the workforce, away from status positions, away from knowledge and dialogue and power, and not just through admissions, though I know Dr. Jacobs will be talking about this as well. This exclusion is by design, and we have to understand this design as aligning with a history of eugenics and ableism. 24% of first-year university students self-declare as having a disability, most commonly related to mental health. But that 24% is in stark contrast to the only 6 to 9% of university students who get help. We have a generation of students, and there's two specific things that are notable in this cohort of students that we see from things like the National College Health Assessment Survey. This is a generation who's much more likely to experience higher education as disabling, and a bad combination, they're also much less likely to seek help. 27% of Canadians have university degrees, but only 17% of Canadians with disabilities have degrees. While more students with disabilities may be enrolling than in previous eras, nearly 2/3 are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years. A very modest estimate based just on the small number of students who get accommodations suggests that 10% of people with disabilities leave post-secondary institutions before obtaining their credentials. Of course, this could be much more like 30% if we extrapolated from the number of students with self-declared disabilities who never seek help. Disabled students are also likely to have up to 60% more student debt by the time they graduate. As Sarah Mohammed reveals, debt is particularly onerous for students with disabilities who require more time to complete their degree or diploma, and this is a major contributing factor to persons with disabilities having lower application, admission, and graduation rates, as well as higher rates of leaving and switching programs. There's actually a lawsuit in the news just recently challenging Canada's student loans program for its role in creating this debt inequity. The simple extrapolation tells us that at least 100,000 Canadian post-secondary students right now have the right to accommodations but will never seek them. In the United States, some studies show that 2/3 of college students don't receive accommodations simply because their colleges don't know about their disabilities. And those who do seek accommodations are likely to do so only in their 3rd or 4th year. Whatever the numbers and whatever the statistics tell us about how the dire prospects might be for disabled students, these statistics only speak for the very small number of students who successfully navigate the complicated accommodation process to seek help. There's something about the culture of higher education I think we have to understand and admit when students who get this help in K-12 education come into higher education and they won't seek that help. And it's because we stigmatize disability, right? We could isolate specific disciplines as well. For instance, because of a lack of access to laboratory courses, research indicates that only 4.3% of post-secondary students with disabilities in the United States chose natural sciences as their field of study. Canadian and UK demographics are lacking, but we can definitely assume that the barriers to accessing science and STEM disciplines are much the same in Canada. It's upsetting, but it also tells us that removing barriers to access could help increase the number of students with disabilities who enroll in these programs of study and also improve their numbers in science-related careers where their input is really valuable. We have to look at faculty as well. A recent study revealed that academics in Canada receive little institutional support in obtaining their own disability accommodations. Only 42% of Canadian universities even have a written disability accommodation policy for faculty. The policies that do exist don't centrally fund accommodations. This means that accommodations come out of individual department and unit budgets and compel faculty to disclose disabilities to their chairs and deans. The result is a culture of silence and passing. And the result, unfortunately, is the attrition or the loss of disabled teachers and researchers. And these forces that push disabled students, staff, and faculty out of higher education, away from their right to an education, they intersect with other forms of discrimination. We know that Black males are disproportionately placed into categories of special education that are associated with extremely poor outcomes at the K-12 level. And yet, as education researcher Joy Banks has shown us, Black students with disabilities in higher education have real difficulty accessing disability support services and accommodations at that level. So for that same group of students, a disability diagnosis at K-12 level can be hastily applied. And at the post-secondary level, that help is so much more difficult to get. A recent Higher Education Quality Council report on the Toronto District School Board, for example, showed that having special education needs in high school means you're less likely to go to university, and that's been getting worse over time, not better. Notably, being a student of color also makes you much more likely to be labeled with these special education needs. So we see the presence of ableism in higher education persistently. When we also understand that universities create doctors and nurses and special educators, and therapists who learn how to rehabilitate or cure disability or how to tokenize and minimally include it, but seeing disability as fixable or eradicable or wanting to fix and get rid of it is very, very different from seeing disability as desirable, understanding disability as an identity and a culture. In short, we're educating people to erase and diminish disability, and that ensures limitations on all of our knowledge about bodies and minds. How can we really understand the complicated problems we face as a society when disabled people are absent from classrooms, labs, and research teams? The last 18 months should have shown us that their inclusion is essential. Educators have to recognize both the long history of exclusion and experimentation upon people with disabilities, as well as the more recent history of academic ableism. Right now, the idea of attending higher education has also forever changed. Who will have a choice about teaching or learning in person on campus? Who will get to choose to work and learn from home? What social and student-centered spaces will replace physical ones? How is teaching changed right now just by moving some of our barriers online with the same demands of student time and productivity? What regimes of individualization, personal wellness are being put into place? What new regimes of control and surveillance are being built or have been built? In the history of disability in higher education, a rights-based approach has often meant that disabled students are invited in the door, they're counted and added to diversity statistics, But then the culture of the university makes no changes, no lasting adjustments to account for their presence, participation, and thriving. And I'm going to show an image here that I've labeled Academic Ableism at Hull University. This is a tweet posted by a student named Sarah Marie De Silva from the University of Hull in the UK. And she tags the tweet with Do Better Academia and Uni of Hull. What we see, she's posted this picture on Twitter showing how she's forced to take in her zoology lectures. When she arrives at the lecture, there's only one place for her to sit, in the doorway at the back of the room. When she gets in, there's nowhere to go, right? So in this image, what we see is a wood paneled classroom. There's a door at the back of the room and a very small doorway at the back of the room. And that door is an accessible door, right? If you press a button, it opens for you automatically. So it's an accessible space, inviting people into the room. But when the student comes in that space, there's only one place that she can go in her wheelchair, and that is right at the landing at the very top of the room. So in fact, anybody else opening that door to come in, she needs to move out of the way or she'll be hit by the door. All of the other students are arranged in the classroom in rows that descend down through the kind of amphitheater-like space. So you have to go down the steps to access the other seating in the room. Right. So this to me is a real example of academic ableism, but it's what so many of the physical, but also the curricular and cultural layouts within higher education actually look like. Disabled students may be there, may be able to get into the room, but their access is so clearly an afterthought. Their participation is already minimized. It's no wonder we're losing so many disabled students. We acknowledge that our students come from different places, that they're headed in different directions, yet this does little to alter the vectors of our own teaching, our own pedagogy. Most often, the only time disability is spoken or written about in class is in the final line of the syllabus, when students are referred to the Office of Disability Services. The message is that disability is a supplementary concern, a legal, medicalistic concern, and then that it's not the teacher's concern and not really a part of the course. It's at the back door of the syllabus. To begin with, the nature of the retrofitted accommodation process that we have actually requires us to make no lasting changes to our pedagogy or to the culture of the university. One metaphor I use is it's like the game whack-a-mole. When a disabled student shows up, we hit that student with an accommodation and we hope that it doesn't happen again, right? And to begin with, there's such a limited range of accommodations offered. Extended time on tests and exams is offered more than 3/4 of the time. So the vast majority of the accommodations that are offered is simply extended time on tests and exams. If, like me, you don't offer tests or exams very often and never in a timed way, that's good, I guess. But if you keep working with disability services and they keep offering this accommodation, then we're short fusing the process. This ramp or door leads students nowhere. So we need a much broader repertoire of accommodations. If you look at any of our departments, any of our faculties, the ways that they talk about teaching and learning are really innovative. They're talking about experiential learning, hands-on learning. They don't talk about it in a traditional sense, but those new classrooms, the new learning spaces and labs, the new experiential spaces, they need to be made accessible as well, right? That said, retrofitted adjustments are still legally mandated and we need to continue to offer them. But how can we allow retrofits, temporary fixes to become permanent? What are some of the ways that in higher education we've taken accommodations that were made over time and turned them into mainstream pedagogical techniques? You can go away from this slide now if you want, that's okay. We've had an opportunity over the last 18 months to redesign higher education in ways that we never have before. Yet nobody, or at least very few people, were talking about accessibility as part of that process. For example, we spent much more time investing in surveillance test proctoring software than we spent developing alternatives to outdated teaching models that rely on testing. There's some irony that the ableist demands for physical attendance and participation that teachers used to cling to so tightly have now been so easily left behind. Asking to have a grade converted to credit rather than a numerical grade, asking for an extended deadline, getting extra time for faculty on a research grant or a tenure deadline. All of a sudden, anyone who wanted those things could have them. Disabled people can hardly count the number of times they were denied those things and stigmatized for even asking about them before the pandemic. That said, if expanded access is being called for, let's ride that momentum. The problem is that most of the ableist demands of academia will likely slide right back into place. The advocacy of actual disabled people, unfortunately, based on the patterns we've seen, is unlikely to be determined, is unlikely to be what determines that future if we don't advocate for that now. For example, as we were forced to pivot online, many people learned how to caption video maybe, or how to provide transcripts, or how to share materials so that students could access them at any time. But in a recent study of engineering students with disabilities at the University of Illinois, results from 303 responses from 49 different courses showed that students with disabilities have always, well before the pandemic, been asking for those things: recorded lectures, recorded as videos, transcripts for those videos and lectures, access to course materials outside of class setting, right? These were all things that we began to offer quite broadly during COVID. But they were all things that we probably should have been offering all along. So I think one key takeaway is we need to keep doing it, even when we move back into the physical classroom. But that's just a small place to start. What did you do, for example, in your research environment in order to continue to keep your research program going? Did some of those things increase access more generally? Can you keep doing those things? What have you changed about your teaching since the pandemic began that you could keep doing in order to keep increasing accessibility? My challenge for you is to think about the barriers students might be facing right now during this most recent wave of the pandemic, and also to explore how they get accommodated. How have we built accessibility into our COVID pivot to online learning? How will we need to retrofit and accommodate our teaching in ways that remove barriers when we finally do return to campus? And how can we sync these with our own access needs and our own safety? I want to offer pretty quickly a few examples. I think that during our first pivot to teaching to online teaching during the pandemic, we came to understand things like attendance and participation in new ways. We were forced to create more expansive ways for students to learn, and to expand the when of that learning, right? Outside of the 50 to 80 minutes that they were originally in a room with us. But I think that teaches us that we should never assess student involvement in learning based only on being in the classroom, or based only in 50-minute chunks again. The ability to attend classes in flexible ways needs to become a right and not a concession in higher education, because our understanding of the safety of our campuses, the risks posed to those who work and learn there, needs to forever change. We can't really fantasize about a post-COVID return to normal. Our campuses were never as safe and equitable and accessible as we thought they were. It's just that the risks and burdens were always borne mainly by disabled people. And the example of Sarah Marie da Silva, I think, is a powerful one. Moreover, for faculty, as Arlene Cantor, faculty and staff, as Arlene Cantor of Syracuse University very recently argued, while discussions of the future of remote work have been a hot topic during the pandemic, given the current realities of the post-pandemic workplace, remote work is a reasonable accommodation for qualified disabled employees, and we will need to lobby for changes and amendments to the current policies to re-envision remote work as one of the futures of disability accommodation. Our university workplaces are, we need to admit, much riskier places than they have ever been before. And this risk disproportionately impacts disabled people. We also need to admit that the ways universities approach risk have always been highly problematic. So we either actively advocate for our rights now, or we stand back and watch them disappear. So that's one big piece, and it's a piece I think we need to drastically reconsider for faculty, for staff, and for students. And that is this idea of physical attendance. Here's another interesting example. My own Faculty of Arts at Waterloo was told by our Associate Dean in the spring of 2020 to actually pull back on assignments in the courses that we were offering in that spring term, near the beginning of the pandemic. This allowed me and many of my colleagues to actually teach more, to connect with students more, and to assess less. So my question is, why should we ever go back? I think that's a second pillar for us to understand and assess, right? How can we adjust content and expectations of student labor? How can we make changes to the biggest stressors systematically rather than asking students to be resilient and adjust individually? And one place to start, I think, is by simply looking at pulling back on the amount of content, the amount of assessment that we do, so that we can make space to do more connecting with students, for them to connect more with one another, and for us to do more teaching. In winter of 2020, despite their centrality to educational culture, we were also asked to find alternatives to timed in-person tests and exams. Well, this is my soapbox, but they were never a good way to assess student learning. And despite the lore that supports their continued use, there's no research that shows that students learn more, retain more information, study more effectively, or even properly reveal what they've learned when a test or exam is timed. There's no research. And at the same time, we're spending almost all of our accommodations budgets and time, labor on granting extended time on these pretty ineffective instruments. Testing in higher education is a significant creator of barriers, in particular for people with learning disabilities and mental health related disabilities. And it doesn't make sense to think that these students will experience anything like these barriers in the environment outside of school, right? Nobody walks into an engineering firm and says, put your pencils down, whatever bridge you've drawn up is the one we're building. So why would we train engineers or anyone else to think and work and collaborate under those constraints? The truth is, there will be other barriers for students when they reach the world of work, right? But nothing like the barrier imposed by a timed test. So if we're working on accommodations in the learning environment at university, why are we not working on accommodations that are more likely to be like the ones they need in the world of work, right? I understand that many in STEM fields believe that there are no easy alternatives to time testing. But I also want to remind folks just how few disabled students choose these fields. And that's a third big point here. I think we need to connect the dots if we want to correct that huge loss of student potential in STEM. We know that there are accommodations that can really help students in the classroom, including help with note taking and record keeping, technological solutions around communication and memory, right? And those are accommodations that actually will matter in the workplace as well. And I also want to suggest that if we simply planned and expected more disabled students in our classrooms, we could really change the shape of higher education. It's a seemingly innocuous, but I think kind of revolutionary question. What if we allocated all of the energy we spend on adapting an old educational regime based on timing and testing into building a new one in which disabled students don't always need to ask for accommodations, but instead their needs are expected? We did it for one term, but if your university talks about things like universal design for learning and isn't also willing to talk about seriously cutting back on timed assessments or reconfiguring attendance and participation policies or taking a long, hard look at workload, then they're not really talking about accessibility. Finally, for the last decade, I've been working on creating a long list of universal design teaching ideas, right? And these are, we can call it universal design, we can call it accessibility. There are ways to think about changing the classroom so that all students can learn more, right? They've been created collaboratively through workshops and discussions like this one. And I call them places to start because that's how I want fellow teachers to approach them, as things that they can try and experiment with in their own teaching as early as tomorrow. So I want to challenge you to visit this site and to pick a universally designed teaching technique to try. That resource is up on the webpage. I also want to point out that there's a link to the open access version of my book, and basically any of the articles or the research that I've mentioned today, there are hyperlinks to that research so that you can follow up and learn more. And that's all at that address, beyondaccommodation@wordpress.com. So thanks for your time today. I hope we can talk more. I'm looking forward to Dr. Jacobs' talk. I hope we can also answer some of your questions. I think we can all agree that before COVID, our schools had too many unnecessary barriers in place for students and for faculty. During the pandemic, we all viewed and experienced new barriers, or we saw the old ones from new perspectives. And now I think we have a chance to build something different.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dolmage, for those remarks on academic ableism, accommodation, and access. for all the resources you shared during the lecture and on the website. And I can already tell you people are accessing them and including in social media. So they're going to be helpful beyond this webinar. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions for you. So I encourage people to put them in the Q&A section of this webinar. So thank you. So what I'd like to do next is turn over to the floor over to our second speaker, Dr. Laverne Jacobs, who will be speaking on meaningful access to post-secondary education beyond legal perspectives. Dr. Jacobs is a full professor of law at the University of Windsor, founding director of the Law, Disabilities and Social Change Project, Canada's candidate for the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Her recent book, Law and Disability in Canada, was published earlier this year. The hyperlink to those are in the bio online as well. She's currently working on another book, Disability, the Rights of Access and the Law, from Litigation to Citizen Participation, Routledge, is forthcoming with Routledge in 2023, which this book focuses on accessibility legislation, the newest and most rapidly growing form of equality law for persons with disabilities. So please join me in welcoming to the virtual floor, Dr. Laverne Jacobs.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for the kind invitation to be here and also for the very kind introduction. I'm honored to be part of today's event for International Human Rights Day and to take part in this conversation along with my colleague and co-panelist, Dr. J. Dolmage. I join you from the University of Windsor, which sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprising the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. I identify as a Black woman with physical disabilities, and I'm a power wheelchair user. As Dr. Smith mentioned, I'm writing a book that looks at the right of access, and that focuses especially on accessibility legislation, its design, use, and the consultation processes behind it. So my interest in this particular topic connects to that work, but it connects more broadly to my experiences as a faculty advisor for the Students' Disability Group at my faculty, also to working generally with students with disabilities at the university, and to 14 years of experience sitting on the Accessibility Committee at the university. I've seen a number of woes concerning accommodation and other elements of accessibility in the post-secondary education context. So with that bit of background, let me turn to my thoughts on meaningful access to education and how we might get there. And I can start off by saying quite simply that I think we need to do much, much more to ensure meaningful access for students with disabilities to post-secondary education and to really provide disability justice. So let me share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation that will be used to guide this discussion. Okay, so I want to start with an overview for today. And in this overview, I propose to do 4 things over the course of this short talk. And the first is to talk about promises of meaningful access to education and how this has come through in our law in Canada. I also want to talk about enhanced human rights principles and the promises that are held within the context of admissions for students with disabilities who are applying to post-secondary education. After that, I will make reference to additional legal instruments for accessible post-secondary education. And I'll follow that with an overview of the non-legal tools, or some of the non-legal tools that I think are quite important for improving access. Throughout, a theme that I will be emphasizing is that there's still miles to go. And I draw this expression from the late Diane Poitier. She'd written an article, 30 years ago. Professor Poitier was a professor with visual impairments at Dalhousie University. And she talks about, the challenges with attitudinal bias, et cetera, in this article. So there are still miles to go, unfortunately, now in 2021, at the end of 2021. But I'm hoping that through this talk, we'll find a few possible avenues to travel. And I think it's really interesting that in Dr. Dolmage's talk, he mentioned that disability is sometimes and often, I think, seen as a legal concern. And so within the framework of this talk, I'd like to show how that legal concern and the legal bases that we've been provided do not actually take us far enough. So let me start with the first decision that I think is extremely important. There are two that I'll be talking about today. And this decision is a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada from 2012. It's called Moore. It's a case that stems from British Columbia. In this case, the father of Jeffrey Moore, who was a student with dyslexia, argued that his son suffered discrimination when the school board discontinued the dyslexia program in which he was enrolled. So this is a case that does not deal with a post-secondary education context, but which provides us with a concept, that of meaningful access to education, which is applied vastly throughout the law, human rights law, as it affects persons with disabilities. So the discontinuation of the dyslexia support program was due to provincial funding cuts. And at their own expense, Jeffrey's parents enrolled him in private school as an alternative. The Supreme Court of Canada, in this case, tells us that meaningful access means having adequate support to obtain education on an equal basis with others. So students with disabilities should be able to obtain education on an equal basis with others. And I've placed this quote on the slide from Justice Abella, where she says that when we're thinking about what the services that students with disabilities should be obtaining, we shouldn't be categorizing that service as special education. That's not the service that we want to provide students. In fact, students have the right to get meaningful access to the general education. That's the service that's available to all students in the province. And so she's saying that it's important to think of meaningful access as access to the right to education, a general education, as opposed to a right to special education or special needs that we sometimes see. Just a little bit more from Justice Abella. I have also placed on this slide a quote where she says, to define special education as the service at issue also risks descending into the kind of separate but equal approach, which was majestically discarded in Brown and Board of Education of Topeka. And many of us will remember, or at least remember the reference to this case from the 1950s, at the time when there was a segregated education in the United States. She's saying here that it's not a question of providing access to a segregated special type of education. It's not about providing education that's separate, but that we can, I would say, pretend to be equal. What it is about is making sure that students with disabilities have access to the broader education. And the last point that I have on this slide is just that emphasizes that the idea that if we allow education for students with disabilities to be seen as that education within a special context, then it would be fine, theoretically, to get rid of all special education or to fund all special needs programs in a very minimal way. And so Justice Abella is fighting against that. And it's for these reasons that the Moore decision provides us with some useful guidance and useful concepts within the context of disability and the law. The final 2 points that I have here simply emphasize that discrimination was found in this case. It was education was something that was ordinarily provided to the public, a service provided to the public, and it was unjustifiably or arbitrarily denied to a certain group, students with disabilities, despite the fact that they're protected under the Human Rights Code. And that's essentially what the second point says as well on this slide. So Moore presented us with a few new, different, forward-thinking ideas. But one thing that remains as we think about the Moore case is that we're still within a reasonable accommodation paradigm. And my co-panelist, Dr. Dolmage, spoke quite a bit about the need to get away from thinking about students as kind of an afterthought, students with disabilities as an afterthought. Reasonable accommodation very much is about that afterthought paradigm. It's not about thinking about, it doesn't concern thinking about students with disabilities from point zero and making sure that they are included. Instead, it's about retrofitting, thinking about how we might, assist a student so that they can, fit with a program that was not designed with them in mind at all. So I see this as a considerable limitation on the Moore decision, despite its forward-thinking ideas about meaningful access. There's a second case that I want to discuss as well, and this case is called Longaway Pay. It's a case dealing with the University of Waterloo. It was decided by the Ontario Court of Appeal last year in 2020. And it deals with admissions to the University of Waterloo, and in particular, of course, admissions concerning a student with disabilities. So Mr. Longaway Pay applied to the University of Waterloo. He had started a degree at Dalhousie University, but he did not complete that degree. During the time that he was at Dalhousie, and he was really only there for about a year, he had undiagnosed and unaccommodated disabilities. He wasn't aware that he had these disabilities, so he did not seek any accommodation while at Dalhousie. It was only after he left Dalhousie and some time had passed and he decided that he was going to apply to go to Waterloo that he, he realized, I suppose, he had gone and investigated and determined that he had these disabilities. So he applied to the University of Waterloo, and the matter, his file, was sent to a special admissions committee at the university. But one of the challenges with this process was that the committee didn't actually they didn't grapple with how to evaluate the unaccommodated grades. So they saw that he had poor grades, that the grades did not meet the admission criteria. And based on that, they determined that he wasn't eligible, he was inadmissible, and wrote him a letter to that effect. Now, in Mr. Longaway Pay's file, he also had reference letters, he had testimonials, he had information about work experience, volunteer experience. None of this was taken into account by this admissions committee at Waterloo. And so he went further to the Human Rights Tribunal. Eventually, this decision, wound its way up to the Ontario Court of Appeal. And what the court held was that the admissions committee did not make any effort to understand how Mr. Longaway Pay's disabilities might have affected his capacity or ability to obtain minimum grades. So they didn't think about the barriers that may have affected Mr. Longaway Pay at the time when he was at Dalhousie. They certainly didn't think about the other ways that he may have shown his ability to succeed at Waterloo. So, you know, I'd mentioned those additional reference letters, work experience, etc. In other words, they really didn't do much else than, you know, realize that he hadn't met the minimum grade, whatever that was, 65%, I think, and determined that that was enough to establish that he would not be successful at Waterloo. So the Ontario Court of Appeal decision is helpful because it opened university admissions processes to human rights scrutiny. So as I'd mentioned, this case had been brought to the Human Rights Tribunal, and ultimately on appeal, the Court of Appeal held that there should have been closer scrutiny of this file. There should have been some discussion, some analysis of ways that Mr. Longaway Pay may have faced barriers or may have, you know, been able to succeed with supports. What's really interesting about this case is that previously, the world of universities, and particularly any procedures that were seen as core procedures, and certainly admissions was one of them, was very insulated. It was an area that was protected. If you read historically through the case law, there is a certain amount of deference that's always given to universities because of the work that they do. They are seen to have a certain amount of autonomy that needs to be preserved. So this opening up to human rights scrutiny is actually quite significant. But at the same time that the door has been opened to more scrutiny, there are still many elements that remain to be determined. And the court talks about how, even if the door is open, it's not quite clear when a university can claim that it's undue hardship for it to be reviewing all of these extra materials and determining, how a person with disabilities may have been accommodated or may have faced barriers because they were not accommodated. So the court actually leaves this kind of as an open-ended question. In this particular case, undue hardship had not been argued. And so we'll have to see what happens if it is argued in the future. I want to make one additional point, and this is the point I made with respect to Moore. And so we're building on the same theme. And that's the point that we're still working within a reasonable accommodation framework. This paradigm is still one where, the committee was looking to accommodate Mr. Longaway Pay, and the court declares that it hadn't done so appropriately. But again, we're in the realm of reasonable accommodation where the student with the disability and their needs are seen as secondary, and definitely were not things thought of at the get-go when the admissions process was designed. Okay, so those are two key cases that show us that steps have been made within the law, but at the same time, there is room for concern. We haven't gone far enough. Both of those cases fit within the realm of statutory human rights legislation. On the slide, I outline 4 different legal instruments, or 4 types of legal instruments that can be used to make challenges when it comes to disability, students with disabilities in the post-secondary realm. So statutory human rights legislation we've spoken about. Another one to keep in mind is constitutional law. So the Canadian Charter, Section 15 deals with equality. That can be used in the context of governmental action. So whereas the statutory human rights legislation works both in the public context for government and with respect to private contexts, constitutional law and the Charter in particular works only with respect to government. Another tool or equality instrument to keep in mind is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. This particular instrument has an article 24.5 that deals with education in a tertiary capacity. And so, it could be used. Often we'll find that the Canadian government, says quite clearly that the domestic tools that we have already kind of fulfill what the CRPD requires. But I think it's always useful to try and get the CRPD into our domestic jurisprudence. So it's another tool that I think could be used. The final instrument that I want to talk about is accessibility legislation, and in particular, accessibility standards. And I think this is a really interesting and possibly quite a fruitful tool for moving us forward through the several miles that we still have to go. In Ontario, just recently in November, actually, there was a draft of an accessibility standard for post-secondary education. And so I've placed a link to that in the resources, but let me back up a little bit and say that accessibility legislation generally is the newest wave of laws, a newest wave of equality laws designed to address discrimination against people with disabilities. So we see in Canada that there have been already 4 provinces that have enacted accessibility legislation. Ontario was the first. BC was recently had some legislation enacted in June. And the 5th province, Newfoundland, is in the process of designing this legislation. There's also legislation at the federal level, and I've given you a hyperlink to the annotated Accessible Canada Act, so you can take a look. In the annotated ACA, which I put together with some colleagues, in this resource, which is open access, there's also quite a bit of discussion about the other places, the other provinces where it's been enacted. So accessibility legislation is often seen as a positive way of moving forward because it's proactive. It's designed to address barriers in society before, for barriers for people with disabilities in society before they become problems. And so instead of having to go to the Human Rights Tribunal or go to court for every single barrier, the idea behind it is that many of these barriers will be addressed and that the standards will legislate how much or what types of things need to be done in order to avoid them. There are positive and negative, comments, concerns, aspects of the accessibility legislation. So I've talked about how it's proactive. Being proactive, this means that a lot of the reasonable accommodation elements that I was talking about with Moore and Longaway Pay, those cases kind of, remove themselves. So that's definitely a plus. Instead, we have kind of the first order equality that I think many people with disabilities are seeking, where we are aiming through accessibility legislation to design systems that have taken people with disabilities into account from the beginning. So that's definitely a positive. The process of designing these standards works through collaborative consultation. So people with disabilities are brought into the consultation process. In Ontario, for example, there is now mandated that 50% of these consultation committees are comprised of people with disabilities or their representative organizations. So they're brought into the process. At the same time, there are drawbacks. Sometimes you'll see that the standards seem to be a bit of a compromise because of clearly it seems because of the discussion amongst those who are working together from different stakeholder groups. Other challenges that we've seen in the provinces, for example, in Ontario, deal with timelines. So whether or not timelines can be met, and enforcement and compliance. And so sometimes there have been significant hurdles making sure that those who are subject to these standards actually comply. So cycling back, I'd started off by saying that Ontario was the first province with post-secondary education accessibility standards. And I've given you a link to the draft standard, which was just circulated for public comment. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more about it because I think it provides some really interesting angles. There are over 170 recommendations in this accessibility standard for post-secondary education, and that's a lot. And I just want to highlight three. The first is that there are accessibility standards for teaching and learning that will be mandated to be designed for various forms of teaching. So they'll be designed for lectures, labs, field placements, practicums, things like that. And I think that's really key. I mean, we're in an age today where students need to be able to not only, complete book type learning, but go out into these experiential contexts. And so having standards where there are, barriers recognized and ways of addressing them, I think will be very important. The second type of standard that I want to highlight is that there will be mandatory research training on accommodation processes. Sorry, that should have said mandatory training on accommodation processes, ableism, microaggressions, allyship, etc., for faculty and staff. So you can see, I'm sure already, how that already is a crucial, part of the puzzle. The fact that faculty and staff often, are put in positions where they need to come up with accommodations or design processes, etc., and they don't necessarily have the expertise. So this is a way that will ensure that there's at least a minimum amount of training that everyone has on accommodation processes, concepts such as ableism, which are so crucial and which many students suffer from, microaggressions, and allyship, how you can work with students with disabilities if you're not from the same background. And the final thing I just wanted to highlight about this is that it asserts the importance of inclusion, both in class and outside of the class. So there is an emphasis on leadership activities. And again, I think it's really important to think of students with disabilities as not just having in-class supports, but being supported so that they can follow through with their leadership potential. And I take a moment to harken back to what Dr. Smith said at the beginning of our session, that this year's themes for International Day of Persons with Disabilities dealt in part with making sure that there was disability inclusion and support for the participation and leadership of students with disabilities. It's great that the UN has mentioned that. I think we've probably already seen that and thought about it, but it's wonderful to have that underscored. So just to wrap this up, I wanted to highlight some of the non-legal tools and avenues that we can take in light of the shortcomings of the law, although there is some promise with accessibility legislation. I'll remind you that we need first order equality as opposed to reasonable accommodation, which thinks of the student as secondary. We need to, in the classroom, we can use broad, inclusive evaluative processes. So we need to think of different forms of evaluation, different ways of evaluating that are inclusive. I mean, it's possible within the time before your syllabus is due to, find out from students what they need, or find out through SDS what your students need. Throughout departments and faculties, we should have at least one committee of experts on disability issues that can receive concerns. And this committee should have disabled student representatives. Within the broader curriculum, we should reconsider learning outcomes. I think this one is particularly key. So we need to think about what the outcomes are, the learning outcomes for our courses and for our disciplines, and what the tools are that are required to reach them. So it may be that students may not necessarily have to do a moot court, for example, if they're not interested in doing advocacy, oral advocacy. And the final thing, and I've said this often, is that I think it's really important to incorporate readings about the experiences of people with disabilities, and especially readings that have been written by disabled people, and to do this across our curriculum so that people with disabilities, students with disabilities, see themselves in the curriculum and are part of it. So I've given you a list of resources. Many of these, all of them except for one, you can click on. And that is about it. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop sharing my slides.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs. You've both given us so much to work with and to think about and engage. There are a number of questions, have been a number of questions in the chat. And I know Dr. Dolmage is active from experience and as today actively engaged in real time in engaging in the conversation with those on chat. I want to actually start with one of the things you left off with, which is the question of accessibility. I mean, the question of assessments, because they have come up repeat in both of your presentations, and that's actually been one of the primary focus of universities is thinking about making exam accommodations. We know they note takers for some students with disabilities, the longer times for you to take exams in a specialized setting, and these kinds of things. But those accommodations have a particular kind of disability in mind. And the question then is, how do we get universities to think about what's missing in their assumption? Because it's an idea of a singular conception of disability. And so how do we get universities to think of diversity in a much more complex way? It's because they're not thinking of deaf culture. They're not thinking of other ways of thinking about this. But the second thing related to this question of assessment is with regard to exams, particularly those that require a significant percentage of a student's grade to be written exams. And I know Dr. Dolmage says that's not his approach, and he's in any sense, but some universities have these things mandated. So again, there's a design issue here. They design without students with disability in mind. So what can be done? And there's like several questions about this. What can be done to address this? I'll just give one final comment. And another one is about large size classes. And when you have exams that include group presentations or group assignments, again, it requires those who participate in those assignments to be thinking about accessibility as well. And so how can any of these forms of assessments be done better in a way that's more accessible?
I can go first. I can go first, yeah. So I think these are fantastic questions. So thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, how do we think about, how do we get our universities to think about other types of disabilities? I think that it's necessary. I mean, so part of my answer is, I think that training is important. And I'll get back to that in a second. But the other part of my answer is that I think that we need to make sure that those who are at the university are widely read and have, understandings of what's happening. So, I talk a lot about the importance of having a curriculum across the faculty. So if it's the Faculty of Law, in all courses, criminal law, property law, et cetera, that talk about different experiences of disability. And I think the more that we can get this kind of information out there so that it's, quote, normalized, then the more both faculty and students and staff as well will start to realize the need for different types of the need of different types of accommodations. The other piece, of training is also really important, and I think finding the right people to initiate that training and not letting it always fall on the people with disabilities to do is important as well. So I can stop there and turn it over to Dr. Dolmage.
Yeah, thanks. So I think those are perfect. Those are really good suggestions. And I think, and it's a really good and important question. And I'm pretty soapboxy about it, as you can already tell, because it's kind of mind-boggling, actually. Like we see ourselves as research-based practitioners. And if we are one of the things that assessment is really valuable for, most of us would say, is it shows us whether we've been successful in teaching what we're trying to teach. Well, it's a terrible instrument for getting us that information, and if you actually go and look at the research on teaching and learning and assessment, they're all of the lore that we have around exams, the idea that the pressure of having timed exams makes students study more or retain more information or show more of what they know, none of that's true, right? And over again, studies of studies, right, show us that none of that's true. But we still act like it is. We still talk like it is. We still talk like there's no alternative. But we're getting really bad data back about whether we're teaching students or not. So that's part A. So we can't adapt our teaching in a way that's really useful to students or to ourselves from the data we get back from that really flawed instrument, right? And the other thing I'd say is it's intersectional in a way that we really have to understand. Because the only thing that the research shows, the only thing that a time test or exam does is it makes sure that unfair and discriminatory hierarchies that pre-existed the exam or test are maintained and retained. So first generation college students, students with different linguistic background and class background, racialized students, they do more poorly, right? Because the instrument is not designed for them. It's designed through a normate lens. So it's not just that it's a bad instrument. It's not just that it's ableist to keep doing it. It's that it's reinforcing other intersecting forms of oppression in higher education. And really, the reason for doing it, usually, if we really are honest with ourselves, is just because we've always done it this way. Which is not how we talk about our research. It's not how we talk about our institutions. We talk about ourselves as being innovative and entrepreneurial, and yet so much of our teaching is stuck in a really old paradigm. So now I say all of that. I also put a link into the chat there, but there's a great checklist for alternative assessments that has a whole variety of different ways that we might try and do these things. And it was created at University of Waterloo. Some of the irony of it is Centers for Teaching and Learning and Extended Learning, they had to scramble in spring of 2020 to cobble all this stuff together from what existed out there and share it and educate faculty, because we said you can't give in-person timed exams for that one term. So it's an example of the fact that we didn't change things for so long because we're very conservative. We keep doing things the way they were done to us, right? Until we had to. And then it was like, no, we actually can do that. So my hope is that some of the folks who are here and watching today were forced to do that in spring of 2020. They saw that what they got was more interesting, maybe a little more challenging, right? They gave themselves permission to pull back on some of the other aspects of their work because they could see the value of trying to build a different assessment and put the labor into doing that, and that they'll carry it forward. There's definitely, there are so many benefits to getting away from something, it's a simple thing to say, but if universities committed themselves or faculties committed themselves to simply lowering the number of timed assessments that they did, right? Set a goal in your department to just do fewer of them, right? And then share resources around how we do fewer of it. It's a harm reduction approach to begin with, right? And then I truly do believe we become kind of evangelical, right? Once you see how good it is, right? And how much more students are learning and how much more you're seeing of what they're learning, then hopefully it's the kind of thing that more people want to do. We start sharing information and we do more of it.
I wonder if I can say one more thing, and that's, I completely agree with that, and thank you for raising the intersectional piece as well. At our law faculty, we've started to move away from 100% exams, which I can definitely say when I was a law student was the norm. And I think that one of the pieces that, one of the lessons that I think we all need to keep in mind is that, planning is really important. So if we decide to do, quizzes, or maybe not quizzes, maybe papers, etc., we need to think about how to ensure that students with disabilities who may need extra time, even with papers, are able to have that time and able to, do what's necessary. So I'm a big believer in planning. And when I say planning, I mean actually something particular, which is that at the beginning of each semester, I think it's, it's fine to receive information from the Student Disability, Center of your university, to think about the ways that that we can, bring all students in our assessments. I mean, we always usually have at least a week or two at the beginning of the semester before our syllabus is due. So thank you.
Thanks. I mean, we are close to the edge, but I wanted to, if each of you could spend maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds on actually speaking more to what, because if we think about barriers, again, there's a tendency to think of barriers as homogeneous, as a one size fits all. And again, it doesn't think about the intersectional aspects for students. And so I know Jay talked about first gen, it could be the hidden curriculum. You can think about linguistics, second or third languages people are using, just navigating those kinds of things. People. So one of you could just maybe pick a couple of examples of the unthought forms of barriers that universities throw up for students, especially staff, we really talk about, and faculty with disabilities.
Do you want to go ahead, Dr. Jacobs?
Yeah, I'm thinking very fast, but
Me
yes.
too, yeah.
So types of barriers. I think that well, just as a member of faculty with disabilities, I use a power wheelchair. One thing that I often think about is, and this might be intersectional a different way, but how different pieces of the day fit together. So if I'm not advised of meetings being changed or canceled, et cetera, early enough, it may be impossible for me to get transportation, reorganize support workers and things like that. And so I think that there are a number of barriers in that way. And perhaps thinking a bit more about diversity in terms of different types of disabilities. But yes, that's what I can offer in my 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think maybe the only thing that I would add is that, like, again, through the pandemic, we kind of understood, or people, I think, started to understand, like, if I've got this 50-minute class, it's on this platform. Well, I actually can't assume that everybody has access, right? And I can't assume that it's going to work for everybody to be there at that time. Well, the value of teaching is so high that I am willing to be flexible about it, right? And I think the thing to remember is, even when we go back to in-person classes, it's a very imbalanced landscape, right? And we can talk about the effort, outcome gap. There are students who are just working so hard, right, to get to class, right? And it's the reason why all the data and the statistics I gave you for disabled students, it just takes much longer. We have a culture that marks them out to be worn out, however, right? Instead of saying, that it's, you know, and I've also done advising, and I've seen that for most students, what their educational pathway looks like, it's full of bumps and ups and downs and failures. And failure is a learning, right? But we don't design our structures, our programs, our curriculum, anything like that. We have this magical thinking that all these pieces work together and they're all ascending at all the time, right? So to me, it's like extending the grace and some of the grace and flexibility and the allowance that we had for the different contexts from which students are coming into our classroom is just something we can never go back on. You know, we can never change. So I know that's not highly specific, but that to me, it's a value. Rigor is a value that is going to, you know, really destroy the potential of higher education. And grace or flexibility are values that are going to make it really viable. So.
Well, those are great words to end on. So I want to thank you both for accepting the invitation to speak in a Courageous Conversation speaker series. I want to thank members of the audience who are here with us today and all of those who have been actively engaged in the chat and the Q&A and on social media. I also want to say that we have, this is an ongoing series for fall and winter 2021. So in the our next Courageous Conversation webinar, it will take place on January 20th, 2022 on decolonizing disciplines and structures of inequality with Dr. Bambara from University of Sussex and Dr. Buka from Queen's University. These discussions are part of Courageous Conversations. I know are sometimes difficult, sometimes I think they're important. I hope people find them as transformational rather than as checkbox. And they are sorely needed across the post-secondary sector. And I particularly, I'm thinking here of Dr. Dolmage's comment that, you know, there's all this discussion about innovation, creativity, ingenuity, entrepreneurship. And yet, in some ways, we are still path dependent and stuck in very old ways that are, despite the fact that they're not working. But anyway, to the audience, your willingness to be part of these conversations matter to us. And they're the type of conversation engagement we need to build up the momentum on for change. You can find more information on the Courageous Conversation series on our website at ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion. Please look for the link to the Courageous Conversation page in the colorful banner for a list of additional readings and resources from today's speakers, that is from Dr. Dolmage and Jacobs. As well, the upcoming sessions and access to past sessions with videos are all available online with further readings and resources from the speakers and from us as well. So thank you to the panelists for your wisdom. Thank you to those who submitted questions and for your engagement. And we really appreciate your participation and willingness to have these ongoing conversations with us. So thank you. Have a great evening. It's a Friday. Have a good weekend and stay safe and well, and see you next winter 2022. Thank you all.